and weather and geological disasters specifically have increased about 400% over the past 50 years. If you haven't personally experienced a disaster yet, you probably will.
You give the London train bombing example as kind of how plans are designed to benefit officials and not the average Joe.
Men are more likely to be killed by lightning, hurricanes, and fires. Nearly twice as many men as women. Why is that?
It's terrifying that there's a 28% chance of another pandemic before 2030. You're pretty confident about those numbers? Because that's pretty high. It's a topic that I thought, oh, well, we don't get that many disasters here in the United States. And of course, now the week that we're recording this, the wake of, what was the last hurricane we hit that has like historic levels of damage that's going to take years to rebuild that just happened?
Helene, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So
with another one on the way. Yeah.
Yeah, and another one on the way, which hopefully doesn't hit the same spot, although I don't even know. Is that better or worse? It's just like hard to, I don't even know how to sort of parse that. And people post these photos and you go, oh yeah, down tree. But then you realize it's like hundreds of square miles of that. And it's just sort of mind blowing because again, disasters don't, am I mistaken that disasters don't usually happen in America? Or is it just that our disasters don't seem as bad as one in Haiti, for example?
Well, okay, this is actually a really interesting question because disasters happen quite frequently and they've gotten more frequent since I wrote the original book. So there's kind of an interesting paradox here and it gets more hopeful. So just hang out with me for a second.
Okay.
So from 2011 to 2021, 90% of American counties went through a federally declared disaster. So that's a lot of people. 90% of the population essentially lived in or very near a disaster zone. So we have quite a lot of disasters, and weather and geological disasters specifically have increased about 400% over the past 50 years. But going back to your point about Haiti, we've actually gotten much better at surviving them over the same time period, which is kind of interesting. So the number of deaths has dropped by about 2/3 over the past 50 years. So disasters have gotten more frequent, more destructive, financially speaking, and less deadly, if that makes sense. So it's kind of a hard question to answer, but in there is a lot of hope and a lot of reason to do things differently because the reason the same earthquake can hit Florida and cause minimal damage and then wipe out entire cities in other places, or the same storm, earthquake, you name it. It's because of the things we have done to protect ourselves. Notably, building codes would be a major one. So it's this really interesting duality where things are getting worse and better at the same time.
Yeah, I noticed that. So, by the way, I think we should probably define the disasters we're talking about. So it's not like a train chemical spill, right? We're talking about hurricanes, wildfires, pandemics, earthquakes, not, I don't know, terrorism or, like a train overturning in, was it Palestine, Ohio, and spilling chemicals everywhere? Like that's a disaster for sure, but that's kind of beyond the scope of what we're talking about here, right?
Well, it's interesting because I used to think of disasters pretty narrowly, like you're saying, like weather disasters and that kind of thing. Increasingly, the more I've looked at the research, the more similar human behavior is across all those different things you mentioned. So we kind of get into an evolutionarily designed state in these situations. So whether it's a slow-moving disaster, like a toxic train disaster, hazardous spill, or a pandemic, right? Or a fast-moving disaster, you do see people go through the same stages. And that doesn't mean that those differences don't matter. They definitely do matter. Humans in general are much better at recovering from events that end quickly so that there is some safety to recover in. But the behavior is surprisingly similar across really different kinds of events.
Yeah, I've got plenty of questions, especially about the behavior part. But so wildfires seemingly on the rise, climate change issue, any sort of climate change related stuff's definitely on the rise. I mean, it's safe to say we'll see more disasters soon. And I always hate to be kind of negative, but we literally just said there's a massive hurricane that was historic in nature, and now there's another one, and it's been like a week or two since the last one, which is kind of unfortunately proves your point really, really well here. And I guess on the other hand, we know there's a hurricane coming because I don't know about 100 years ago or 50
Good
years ago,
point.
however long it took. They just found out when they were like, wow, this is a heck of a storm. If it gets any, oh, it's getting worse. Never mind. We're all going to die. I mean, this might be,
Yeah,
are we getting better at this? It seems like we
right.
should be.
You've literally captured the exact paradox, right? So yes, disasters are getting more frequent, and we are talking about back-to-back storms right now. We were not, a month ago. So there is some, cyclical seasonal variance. But just this year, or sorry, last year, there were 28 major weather and climate disasters costing a total of $93 billion. So this is a recurring nightmare for many millions of people at this point, evacuating, worrying, recovering, rebuilding, all of this, right? And it's actually a massive tax on our economy because this keeps happening over and over and over. So the bottom line is, if you haven't personally experienced a disaster yet, you probably will, unfortunately. But the upside is that the number of deaths has dropped. So to your point about the hurricanes, like in 1990, the National Hurricane Center could predict the path of a hurricane only about 24 hours in advance. That's all you had to get out of the way, which
Oh,
really isn't
wow.
enough, just based on the way people make decisions about evacuation, and also based on the design of dense urban places. So now the National Hurricane Center can predict the path of a hurricane with pretty good accuracy 72 hours beforehand, which is actually a pretty big difference when it
Yeah,
comes to getting out of
300%
harm's way.
improvement. Because if you think about it, if you live in Miami Beach, they say you have 24 hours to get out of here. It's like, well, I'm going to spend 4 hours debating with my family, 4 hours trying to convince my parents that they also need to evacuate because they're 80, even though they don't want to and they ain't scared of no storm. And then I'm going to spend 4 hours packing, 6 more hours in traffic, and then I'm going to make it out of Florida by the skin of my teeth before that thing destroys everything behind me. And
Exactly.
that's if I act relatively quickly, right?
Right, which you're
So,
not gonna do. I mean, you're asleep
right,
for the first 6 hours, then you hear about it, you're like, I'm sure it's nothing. Then you move on.
right.
Like, and there's a whole. So we typically go through a period of denial and disbelief in every disaster, and you have to kind of build that in and expect that that'll happen. But on average, before people evacuate, in particular, they check with at least 5 sources. So that deliberation piece you mentioned is really important, but also really time consuming. So time is really important, and we have more of it than we did, not as much as we'd like, but there is more than we used to have.
I've heard you say that unless we make major changes, more people will die of distrust than disasters. Tell me what's going on there. I mean, that sort of seems to be the other side of the whole. I'm not leaving. It's my home, and this storm's not going to be. They always tell me to leave, and it's never a big deal. And last time we got robbed or whatever, right? It's gonna. Is that kind of what you're hinting at with this?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I noticed in doing the new edition of The Unthinkable is that one of the changes that's happened is that we're just living in a very low trust climate for a lot of reasons. And it's not just that people don't trust institutions or the news media. It's also that those institutions don't trust the people. And it's also, which causes a lot of deaths in disasters because information gets withheld and so forth, but also that people don't trust each other, their neighbors, as much. And it turns out that in most disasters, the people who will matter most, who will save you and who you will save, are regular people like you and me. It's your neighbors, your coworkers, strangers on a bus. It's not first responders or the people you might think of, because it just takes too long for them to get there. But regular people really matter. So that trust piece is extremely important. We can design all this great new forecasting technology and vaccines and what have you, and that's awesome. But if people don't trust them, then it doesn't really matter, right?
Hmm. Yeah, that's scary. Given, I mean, I've done shows on pandemics and things like that, and it's like, okay, how prepared are we for the next one? And it's like, probably not that much better prepared than we were for COVID, except it could be way worse. And now nobody trusts anything because it's like, well, they said masks were going to work and they didn't stop the transmission and they said to buy them and they said to not to buy them and they said to buy them again. It's like, okay, so when the next one comes, it's going to be toilet paper hoarding, and half the people put on a mask and never take it off, whether you need it or not. And the other half of the people never put on a mask and never will, even if it's like this is the only thing that's going to stop the spread. Like, it's just the people are already in their camps, regardless of whatever the science says for that particular pandemic at that particular moment. Anyway, we'll get there. I'm ahead of myself because I get a little spirited about this whole disinformation and mistrust thing. You've also said when it comes to worst case scenarios, the truth is usually better than the nightmare. Tell me about that. That sounds like maybe good news. I don't know.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's
All
talk
right.
about something positive before we
Yeah.
get back to the
Before we
pandemic.
get back to disasters and pandemics and the inevitability of death. Yes.
Right, exactly. Um, So, one of the things I noticed when I was covering a lot of disasters for Time Magazine is that the things that the survivors told me were very different than what I'd expected. They were very different than what they'd expected. They had specific lessons they wanted the rest of us to know, and many of them were actually positive. In other words, they had not freaked out in the way that they expected. They had freaked out in much more subtle ways, and I'll get back to that. They found that other people, including strangers, were all of a sudden much better behaved than normal.
Hmm.
So rather than the kind of mob mentality, every man for himself that we imagine from movies, in fact, humans tend to become polite and courteous and cooperative almost to a fault
Hmm.
in most disasters for, again, for evolutionary reasons. It's not like, because we're nice, but there's a good reason to do that. So those things are surprising, and if you don't know to expect that, right, you're going to prepare differently. If you don't know that your biggest challenge will not be panic but actually a total lethargy, like a shutting down, that is the biggest, most common mistake that people make in disasters, as opposed to, punching each other out and just widespread mayhem.
Right. So the people who are like stockpiling weapons and ammunition, okay, maybe not a terrible plan, but you also need to be prepared for other people being able to help or you being able to help other people as opposed to just like shooting people that walk on your property because they're definitely going to kill you.
Right, right. Like
Yeah.
having a default bias for hostility is going to not serve you well in most disasters, because actually your best ally are the people around you.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know a lot of people who are prepper-ish or prepper adjacent, and it's usually they're coming for my food, the cans of food, and it's like, or they're coming to give you cans of food and make sure that your kids are alive. But okay, there's just a lot of that. And I guess it depends on where you live, because of course, people I know that are preparing for disasters in California, like us, we buy food and we have water and we have the solar panels and we have batteries. And my wife's like, that's enough for us. There's only so, and I'm like, but the neighbors are going to come over and they're old and they're not going to have this. We need to be able to share with them. We can't be like, sorry,
No, yeah,
80-year-old
that's
neighbors,
right.
have
That's
fun
great.
dying of heat exhaustion in your house without any power. We don't have enough,
Right.
room for you or whatever. So she's like, yeah, that's true. Because there's literally people that we know by face and name, and we're like, they are not going to be able to handle this. They are too
Uh-huh.
old. They can't be in the heat. They can't. They're
Yeah.
gonna have to sleep here. They're gonna have to eat with us. We're gonna have to cook for them. We're gonna need
Hmm.
electricity for their phones and the lights in their room. Like all that stuff we're preparing for. Yeah, we might be a
That's
little
awesome that
light
you're
on it.
it's awesome that you're thinking about that, because
Well,
that is right. Yeah.
we kind of have to, right? Because I'm like, no one's going to save Ildy across the street and her two little boys. Like that's us. She's going to walk over here if she's got any sense about her at that time, right? And but yeah, we're a little light on us on guns and ammunition over here. We don't have a whole lot of that. We got. I probably shouldn't say that. We're armed to the teeth. Don't even think about it. Um, but yeah,
Yeah.
we focused more on the stuff we think we'll probably need, like more water, as opposed to like, armor piercing rounds.
Yeah, and I mean, look, I can understand why some people are afraid of one another, and some people have experiences that justify that fear, and a lot of people have are consuming news, which my business is very much complicit in, that makes them afraid of their neighbors, and so. I don't think it's a simple equation, and it does vary depending on the place and the person and all of these things. But one thing I can tell you for sure is that people tend to behave better in disasters than we expect. And we really need each other very suddenly. So, yeah, pro social preparation is probably going to serve you better.
I know you've said that our first responders are great, but the average person is clueless. I also kind of feel like this is me. Like, okay, fine, I got some food and some water and some electric stuff, but like, I'm an Eagle Scout, and I'm still kind of like, what happens, when you do that? And I'm probably not prepared for mostly anything. And I know that my neighbors and family are not. They don't have anything. They'd be out of luck in a day. Their food would spoil. I mean, it just It seems like
Yeah.
I've taken those courses too, and most
Oh,
of it's
yeah?
in one ear and out the other.
Uh-huh.
So it's like, okay, but that don't, food and water only works if the purge doesn't happen. I mean, maybe I've got 3 to 5 days, and then I'm hurting again.
Right. I think the food and water thing is fine, but I don't think it's very compelling. And I think it's like too small of a frame. I think for me, the best kind of preparation to do, and I actually, it sounds like you do this. So I wouldn't undermine yourself. I mean, you have relationships with your neighbors. It
Yeah,
sounds like you
yeah.
know who needs help, who can do
Hmm.
what, and that is actually huge. So one of the things that I've tried to change in my own life, having done a lot of this reporting, is to really get to know my neighbors better and take those opportunities, right? So it's not just about stockpiling water. It's about building relationship, understanding who has a generator, who is elderly, but also like just knowing each other, so we can trust each other, we can call on each other, and that is the beauty of that, is that you reap rewards from that whether or not there's a disaster. And so I really encourage people to think about what they can do that's going to be good for them and their community right away, no matter what happens. Because there's a lot, you can't predict, but that being in relationship, being able to laugh at a shared joke and being able to share, recipes, and being able to, call someone if your kid is sick, those things really matter, and they make life better right now, regardless of what happens with, the hurricane.
I know people are thinking, but hey, there's emergency plans. The government has a plan. I mean, not if you live in a disaster area, that's probably not true. But you mentioned in the book that emergency plans are designed to benefit emergency officials and not the average Joe. That's terrifying.
Yeah. I mean, you say it and I'm like, wow, that's a little cynical, Amanda. But it is the case that emergency plans are designed with the minds of emergency manager, right? It's like sometimes they're not thinking about the public, and it's hard to get yourself out of your own head and into the mindset of the public. So let's give me an example. Okay. You've heard of hurricane watches and hurricane warnings.
Yeah, but I couldn't tell you the difference.
Right. Because who could? That's a ridiculous way to communicate with humans.
That's a good point.
And yet it's actually a really big difference. So watch means, well, it might happen, it might not. Warning is like, be on alert,
Like
And the
it's
same
happening.
with,
Yes.
yeah, this is particularly true with tornadoes, right? And this is a very big deal. Like tornadoes are very hard to predict. They can happen anytime, anywhere. So the difference between a tornado watch and a tornado warning is really important. And so if you were thinking about this like the public does, or any human who's not an expert, you would not use a W word for both, right? But, just like in any expert field, people have like blinders on when it comes to what people need to hear and understand. So there are exceptions to this, right? There are some incredibly creative, empathetic, and like open-minded emergency managers all over this country. But in general, yeah, I think that a lot of plans are designed not according to how humans actually operate in disasters.
I grew up in Michigan and we had tornadoes pretty regularly. And I grew up there. I was there for decades of my young life. I went to college and law school there. I don't know the difference between tornado warning and tornado watch. And I could not tell you. And I've seen dozens of them at least over my life. So if you move somewhere and this is the first or second time you're seeing that, you're just not going to get it. And you're right. It's a W word for both. I'm like, if it's a watch, are they watching for where it is? No, they're wondering if there is one. Okay, fine. A warning, are they warning us that there might be one, or are they warning us that there is one? I don't know the answer to that. Like, you're right. They use the same logo in the news. It's just the tornado. They use the same color, right? It's branded to the TV station. It's not like one's yellow and one's red. It's just totally ridiculously confusing, especially for younger people or non-native speakers, or literally somebody who has a high level of education and just can't remember the difference between warning and watch. I wonder if my parents, who grew up and spent 80 years there, I wonder if even they know the difference, honestly.
Right. I mean, this is, so this is a small example, but a great example. Another one would be, I was on the subway in DC where I live, and an alert, like a warning came on over the loudspeaker, and it said, in case of emergency, do not panic and listen for further instruction. So
Okay.
it's like, first of all, anytime anyone in charge tells you not to panic, you're in trouble, right?
Right.
And because it signals that they don't trust you, and that they also don't understand how humans normally behave in disasters, which again is not to panic. But then to just say, be passive, don't get in our way, listen, and we'll tell you what to do, again, is a total misunderstanding of how most disasters work. So usually everyone needs to be equipped with some baseline amount of knowledge about their risks and their environment. And then, you're going to be much better off as the whole collective. But those kinds of warnings, I think, reveal a bias against the public and also just unintentional ignorance about how people behave.
All right, just a quick break. I'm going to tell you about something that'll actually make your life easier. If you're thinking about starting a business or you already have one and maybe logo or branding design is not your strong suit, you're going to love Design.com. With Design.com, creating a standout logo is as easy as it gets. You just pop in your business name and your industry, and in seconds, you're going to get thousands of custom logos to choose from. Every design is handcrafted by top designers and exclusive to Design.com, so you're getting something unique. Once you find a design that you like, you can customize the fonts, the colors, the layouts to make it yours. Then you download all those assets and you're good to go. And Design.com doesn't just stop at logos. They've got tools to help you create all of your branding materials, from website to social media posts to business cards, all perfectly aligned with your brand. If you already have a logo, you can upload it and you get instant access to thousands of design templates that actually match your brand's look and your color scheme. So this tool saves you a lot of time. It lets you focus on growing your business instead of getting stuck in the weeds with marketing materials. With a 4.8-star Trustpilot rating, Design.com is legit amazing. It's run by a friend of mine. The company's been around for a while. They really do care about their customers. Try it for free at design.com/Jordan. That's design.com/Jordan.
You give the London train bombing example as kind of how plans are designed to benefit officials and not the average Joe. Tell me about this, because I was really finding myself. It's frustrating to hear examples like this, right? And you just think, oh man, this was nobody thought of a better way to handle this.
Yeah, so I think you're talking about the July 7th, 2005 terrorist
Yes.
attack on
Thank
London
you.
buses and subway trains, which killed 52 people, I believe. So afterward, you heard a lot about the city's extensive surveillance camera system, right, which helped with the investigation. But less well known is how unhelpful technology was to regular people on trains in the moment. So the official report on the response found one overarching fundamental lesson, which is that emergency plans had been designed to meet the needs of emergency officials, not regular people. So passengers had no way, for example, to let the train drivers know that there had been an explosion. Big problem. They also had trouble getting out. The train doors weren't designed to be opened by passengers, and they couldn't find first aid kits to treat the wounded, which turned out all those supplies were kept in subway supervisors' offices, not on the trains. So there's a lot of examples like this. But the point is, unless you are thinking about the public as your ally, as your first line of emergency responders, you're going to make mistakes in how you plan for disasters, especially if you're thinking about them as the enemy, right? If you're thinking about them as like your adversary.
Man, there's so many issues with this, because I kind of get behind the logic of, well, I'm going to keep the first aid kit in the supervisor's office because if anybody needs it, they're just going to come to me and I will help them.
Right. If you kept it on the trains, some kid's going to steal it and it's going to be a mess. There's going to be Band-Aids everywhere. It's going to be chaos.
Yeah. Right. And then it's like, but what if a disaster happens on the train? Oh, crap. We haven't thought of that. We didn't think about that. Yeah, it's so frustrating. It's terrifying that there's a 28% chance of another pandemic before 2030. You're pretty confident about those numbers? Because that's pretty high.
Well, okay. I am relying on estimates from folks who do this kind of forecasting.
Well,
it's very difficult to, right? It's not me, right? But Metabiota is the one that I specifically use, but they do estimates of, what are the chances we'll see another pandemic that kills at least as many people. And actually the chances that we'll see another pandemic that does that before 2050 is about 50-50. So that's kind of terrifying.
Yeah.
We don't know. Right? That's the bottom line. But just given the way, and this is, by the way, another big reason for the increase in disasters, it's not just climate change, but it's also that we've changed how we live and how we, where we build and how we live. So the way that we've become so interdependent, the way that we've become so mobile, right? All of those things have made us much more vulnerable to pandemics. It's a complicated kind of perfect storm of different things. And I agree that because humans always overweight their past personal experience when assessing future risk. So it's not a new problem for us. We know that with hurricanes, for example, if there was a forecast for a really terrible hurricane and everyone evacuated or most people evacuated and then it didn't hit, right, or it wasn't as bad, then we know that the next hurricane people will probably underreact. And the reverse is true, that people sometimes overreact if there was an unusually bad hurricane. So this is a problem we know about. And that's the good news, is because we know how to deal with that. But it is hard. It is hard to undo the damage that has been done by the last pandemic.
Of course, tons of people will deny it's even happening, and relying on people to do the right thing to keep safe is just like it seems like a fool's errand at this point, right? It just seems like there's going to be so many people who decide to do the opposite of what people say to do just because they almost like they want to just flout it. There's almost this sort of, I probably shouldn't entirely blame Twitter, but this is where it's so prevalent. There's almost this weird contrarian movement where it's like, oh, I'm going to do this thing. Oh, wait, no, never mind. The government told me to do it. So now an authority told me to do it. So I'm deliberately now not going to do it just so that I'm the guy who's not following the rules because I'm tough and independent or whatever. And I see this with people that I know. This is not just like an online phenomenon. I see this with people that I know who will call me and be like, oh my gosh, this COVID thing is so scary. What do we do? And I'm like, hey, relax. Maybe stay home for a while, see how it spreads. You don't have to go hoard toilet paper. In fact, you should. It's 2024. Get a freaking bidet already, and like calm down. And then these were the same people that like a week or month later were like, COVID is fake. I'm like, bro.
Yeah.
I remember the call clearly. This was not your opinion back then. It's almost like they just like the machine shut down and they were like, the thing that makes me feel more safe about this is just denying that it's happening at all. And that to me was shocking.
Yeah, I mean that, and now we're talking about our distrust again and polarization. So political polarization means that a lot of people will tend to do the opposite, right, of what their enemy says to do. So the more former President Trump insisted that we reopen schools, the more entrenched you saw the resistance among some of the teacher union leaders. Not all, right? But it was almost like it's a diabolical problem, right? Any kind of intractable conflict like that, because people will start to just, react as opposed to trying to make an informed decision.
Right.
And I think, look, at the same time, I know for myself, if I look back at it, and I spent a long time looking back at it, was not easy doing the update for this book. I found that I was frequently either underreacting or overreacting to the pandemic. Like I was either in total denial and not doing enough, or I was overdoing it and like yelling at my husband for using a public bathroom. Do you know what I mean? So
right.
It's like,
yes.
it's
know
very,
exactly
very tricky to calibrate. And if there's low trust, then, you really don't, you end up maybe over trusting some people and undermining others. No matter what they say, you're going to do the opposite.
Yeah, that's interesting. I do find myself, if I'm honest with myself, I think I did the same thing, right? It was like, in the beginning, oh my God, this is really bad. Let's err on the side of caution. My wife really went off sort of the deep end with like being careful, and we had little kids. And then after a while, I was like, okay, at some point I've got to start living life and listen to the fact that life is, still moving and these people aren't all dying. But then I kind of got like, it's over, but it wasn't, right? I was just like,
right.
I have a binary switch. It's either like we are on lockdown, man. Leave the DoorDash on and I'm going to spray the whole thing with Lysol before I bring it in. Or it's like, screw it. I'm just going to go out to a crowded restaurant because I'm an idiot and this is all done. We're done with this. Yeah. So, and I really had to sort of come back down and be like, oh, wait, no, I just got COVID because I'm stupid and I could have avoided that. And yeah, I know that's going to happen next time because I was aware of this process for the most part and I still screwed it up, right? So it's not like people are just idiots. That's only part of it.
And we say screwed it up, but like it also just objectively is hard. Like it's a unknown and it's constantly moving. And the reality is we just don't make decisions based on cold, hard calculus of risk. That's just not how humans work. I keep having to remind myself how social we are as creatures. And so much of our decisions are about what people around us are doing and what people in our culture community are doing. And I remember vividly, this is embarrassing, but I remember, when I had to travel, which I did quite a bit for work during the pandemic, I would change my behavior depending on which state I was in. Like I'd fly to Florida and no one's wearing a mask. Like we're in these like crowded rooms. And at first I'd be really freaked out. And then by like after day 2, I wouldn't be wearing a mask. And then I get on a plane, fly back to DC, where everyone was always pretty uptight about this. And I would put my mask back on, So it's like you could actually see the hypocrisy in real time.
Yeah.
But
That's
you're
funny.
trying to fit in. Like that's not you're trying to like subconsciously or consciously do what others are doing, and that changes very quickly from place to place.
So we underreact when bad things happen because of looking for patterns in data, which might be social in nature. My favorite, by the way, is when people remove their mask to sneeze and then put it back on. That's like that's chef's kiss delusional nonsense right there.
Or remove it to talk to you.
Right, like thanks.
That?
Yeah, and I remember being on a flight and the flight attendant was like, "You don't have to take your mask off to talk to me. I'm not reading your lips. I can hear you."
It was a mess. It was
what
just
a mess.
Yeah.
I know the bystander effect is a thing when it comes to, say, like a car accident. Do we have that happening at a macro level with disasters as well?
You know what's wild is it really varies depending on your role in the situation. So let me give you an example. When they study building fires, like theater fires or department store fires or stadium fires, people who are working for minimum wage as like, busboys or whatever, servers in that restaurant, they will go to incredibly like over the top ends to help people and help people get out, help people, things that are just really not in their pay grade. But because their role is as helper and their role is as host or what have you, that tends to extend the situation. But the diners or plane passengers or others will become very passive typically and kind of wait to be told exactly what to do, which can be deadly. Every firefighter pretty much has a story about going into a crowded bar or a restaurant and there's like smoke just filling the ceiling, right?
Mm-hmm.
And nobody's doing anything. Everybody's just kind of like joking and laughing. And so I think it's an unsatisfying answer, but I think our behavior varies depending on our role in that moment.
I probably should have defined bystander effect, but this is where like someone falls on their face in a pool of blood in front of you, and if other people aren't doing anything, and you're looking at them, and you're like, "Oh, they're just going to keep walking. I'll just step over this person and keep walking." But of course, as soon as one person breaks that sort of attention bubble and says, "Oh my God, you call 911 and you come over here and help me turn this guy over so he can breathe," and like you don't make sure no one gets him around him and don't move his neck and all this stuff, like then things start to happen. But it's quite shocking. There's numerous YouTube videos, right, where you see an actor fall over or like laying down and they're like, "Help me," and people are just walking over them, and someone stops and looks, but since no one else is doing anything because the other people are actors too, they just like scurry away or they stand there staring and they're like, "Man, someone should really do something about this," and they're the only person who's not an actor in this scenario. It's almost like they just don't want to embarrass themselves by being the person who breaks the bubble of what everyone else is doing. I don't know a better way to explain this.
This is what I'm saying. You defer to the people around you. Like if a smoke detector went off right now, what's the first thing you do? You look around. Like if there's other people in the building, you look around and what are they doing? Like that is the first thing we do. And there's good evolutionary reasons for that, but it can be a problem. I mean, and it's actually a great example what you talked about with the bystander non-intervention problem, because the same exact thing holds in plane crashes or other kinds of disasters. If you give people specific assertive commands, they will comply. They will help. But it's very helpful to say very clearly and loudly, "You in the green shirt, call 911," right? Or do whatever. Or get up and get out of the plane, right? So this is what the flight attendants are now trained to do. Most plane crashes are actually survivable, which always surprises people.
I did not know that. Because you don't hear about those very often, right? It's usually everyone's dead because it blew up in midair.
Right, exactly. But it turns out most plane crashes end up the plane's on the ground, but on fire. So you have very little time to get off before that smoke gets really toxic.
Oof.
So the whole game is getting off quickly. And what they found is in the 70s, there was a series of passenger plane crashes where, again, people had time to get off, and then they found them just, dead in their seats with their hands crossed across their laps. And the research showed, so luckily, and the reason I talk about plane crashes, by the way, is not because they're likely to happen, thank God, but because there's a lot of money spent on studying human behavior in plane crashes. And the behavior is very similar in different disasters. So we can learn a lot from that. So there are, sociologists and psychologists who work for the National Transportation Safety Board and study plane crashes. And one of the things they learned is that if you give people very direct orders, then they will move. So flight attendants, I did some training with them for the book, and they will literally scream at you, get out of the plane, go, 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 leave your carry-on, don't take your bags. And that helps a lot. So if you are in a situation and you happen to know how to get out or what to do, it is important to realize that if you step into that leadership role, people will follow.
I remember, and I've told this story on the show, so I'll keep it short. I remember a long time ago when I was in law school, my friend's dad came to visit them. They were going to a concert, and he stands out on the porch, and I'm studying on the porch with my girlfriend, and I go, "Oh, hey, how you doing? You ready to go?" He goes, "Ann Arbor in the summer is so nice." And then I hear, and he stretches his arms out, and he's standing at the top of the stairs, and the walkway's in front of him, and he goes, and I hear a groan. Like a guttural groan, and he falls completely passed out face first onto the concrete. And his son and their friends are all behind him, and they just stand there and like, "Oh my God." They just keep saying, "Oh my God." And I was like, okay, they probably just rolled a joint or something like that. Nobody's doing anything. So I told my girlfriend to call 911, and she goes, "Okay," but she couldn't find her phone. So I told another guy, "You call 911." And he goes, "What's the number?"
Oh, wow.
And I was like, 911. And then the other kid was like trying to push him over, roll his dad over. I'm like, "Don't touch him,"
Oh my
because he
gosh.
just smashed his face into the concrete from an elevated position. The last thing you want to do is move him. And it's, of course, as soon as the ambulance got there, they're like, "Did you move him?" And we're like, "No, nobody touched him." They're like, "Oh, thank God." Because that's what usually, I guess they said, that's what usually people do wrong, is they're like
Oh,
rolling him around and they're
right.
like, "Are you okay?" And they're slapping him in the face with a broken neck. And
Mm.
it was just shocking. That was just a shocking level of sort of like panic from
Yeah.
people who barely saw what happened. And it's the airplane thing is particularly apt. What is it called? It's called gathering or something, right? People try to like get their
Hmm.
carry on and their
Exactly.
bags, and then they put their shoes back on, even though
Yeah.
they're wearing, I don't know, high heels or something like that.
Yeah.
And this is why you get the safety warning when you sit in the exit row. They're like, "I want to make sure that you are focused enough to pay attention for 5 seconds, because otherwise you're just going to be in the way
Right.
in a
Exactly.
disaster."
Yeah. So I have so many questions. So first of all, what happened to your friend?
His dad, yeah, so he broke his jaw, which is why blood was coming out of his ears, which was really scary. And he had to have it wired shut. And what had happened was, he went upstairs. He was drinking. He was probably like 60 years old, this man. And maybe they smoked something. I don't know. And then he came down stairs, stood up, stretched, and I don't know, maybe pushed the air down in his diaphragm just a little bit, or took too deep of a breath. And he just passed out. And,
Wow.
and he fell forwards, which is really
So it wasn't
unfortunate.
like a heart attack or something.
No, no,
Wow.
no, he just literally like had
Huh.
a, I don't know if head rush is quite the right word. You know, if you force air in your abdomen too much, like when you're meditating, you pass out. It
Hmm.
was probably just something like that, like
Interesting.
almost like a headlock.
Well, and
Yeah.
Jordan, why do you think you reacted the way you reacted? Do you have a theory on that?
One, I've seen some ish before for sure, and like worse than that for sure.
Hmm.
And I'm not entirely sure though. I didn't panic in those situations either.
Hmm.
Probably because I actually knew what to do. Also, it didn't, this is going to sound awful, it didn't hurt that I just met the guy. So I had,
Hmm.
my emotional response was like, "Oh my God, that man just passed out." Like, not,
Right.
"Oh my God, my dad fell over." Like, I
Yeah, it wasn't
understand
like
why
your
his,
world is imploding.
right, his
Yeah.
son was like, "Oh my God, dad." I understood that
Yeah.
reaction. For me, I was like, "Oh, he fell." Not like,
Ah,
"Oh
interesting.
my God, he's dead." I just thought like, he fell, but the blood coming out of the ears that I saw later, that one got my heart rate up. That was
Yeah.
like, "Oh my God, he's dead." Because they
Hmm.
don't, why is blood coming out of your ears? And the reason that happened was, I guess, his jawbone had pushed through that tube that connects to your ear, and then blood came out of
Hmm.
it. That was just obviously terrifying.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, you never want to see that. And so,
no,
and how did people react when you did give them assertive orders?
well, aside from the guy asking me what the number was for 911,
Yeah.
they did it. And I remember afterwards, they were like, "Wow, that was really cool, man. Thank God you did that." And my girlfriend was like, "Wow, you really remain calm." She was very impressed. I was very happy about that new relationship. That was quite That was quite interesting because it doesn't seem that complicated. Maybe I am wired a certain way, or maybe just look, I was in Boy Scouts for like a decade or something, right? I think they trained us to do all that stuff early in the game, and that might be why. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, it's probably a combination of things, right? Like you said, you had some distance from this particular person, so you could kind of look at it without as much, shock and awe and that kind of thing. But also maybe you had experiences like this, so you kind of know that like things can go upside down really quickly, and you're not kind of stuck in that denial phase as long as others might be.
That's
So that's
true.
something that we know that people do spend a good deal of time trying to fit what's happening into their like brain's library of everything that's happened before. So if
Oh,
it doesn't fit, right, then that's going to really slow you down.
yes. Okay. So I have something to definitely to say about denial. I've told this story a zillion times, so I will not belabor the point. But when I got sort of mini kidnapped by a taxi in Mexico 20 plus years ago, and I remember looking out the window and thinking, I'm not getting kidnapped because I've never been kidnapped before. So this isn't what getting kidnapped probably feels. And I was just like, that's the dumbest line of thought that anyone has ever had. Of course, I've never been kidnapped before. It doesn't mean that I'm not getting kidnapped now. And I had this whole dialogue was going on in my head.
Yes.
And this is pre-smartphone, right? So I wasn't like, let me look at Instagram and distract myself from this difficult conversation. I was like, nope, I'm just stuck in this car, looking out the window, getting further away from my destination. But the denial was really strong. And only when I finally realized that I was in denial actively and my brain was fighting me every step of the way, only then was I like, this is a very dangerous situation and I should do something about it. But I don't know how long that was. That could have been like 15 minutes or longer. I really don't know. It was a long time.
Wow. Yes, that's a great example, right? Where, your brain will come up with every possible creative explanation for what's happening to normalize it, to make it seem like a normal time. And this happens even with, trained, experienced pilots whose plane is about to crash, as they report saying afterward, I'm not a person who crashes airplanes. Just like you said, I'm not a person who gets kidnapped. So this is something we should expect. Now, the good news is if you know that denial is definitely going to happen to you in almost every scenario like this, then you can sometimes notice it happening and push through it more quickly. I know I've done that myself I've for whatever reason been in a couple of different gunshot incidents recently, gunfire incidents. And
Jeez.
because I know I was fine, but because I know that other people around me will, depending on the situation, deny and disbelieve what's happening, I know not to trust their cues necessarily, right? If I hear a gunshot, I know what that is, right? So I'm going to take action. And so this is the kind of thing where just a little bit of knowledge can be really, really helpful. Otherwise, you can really get stuck in that phase.
That is quite insightful. When I was in the denial phase of this taxi kidnap thing, which I've told it for people who don't know, I've told it on the show. It's called "Kidnap Me Once." The episode, it's quite old, but one of the things that happened was I was making excuses for the driver. I was like, oh, maybe there's traffic or maybe there's an accident. And then I said, hey, why are we taking this way? And he said, I need to ask for directions. And I was like, yeah, we're going to the center of town where the presidential palace is. That answer is like the wrong answer. If he had said there's traffic because I just came up this way, I would have been like, okay. But he said something that just I knew in my heart of hearts was not true. But if he hadn't said that, if I'm honest with myself, I probably would have just believed his excuse because I was so uncomfortable with what was going on.
Right.
And
And you're in a power, I mean, you're not driving. Like
no, and I
it's
couldn't open the door.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very delicate. You want everything to be okay. And you also don't want to create friction with this person, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I've definitely been in that situation with Uber drivers or cab drivers. It's pretty terrifying. And it's good that you realized it.
Mhm.
Because you're right. Today you'd be on the phone and you would just be not even noticing,
Right.
probably.
You just look up or unless you're using Uber or something like that, or you just look up and you'd be like, this doesn't look right. That my brother-in-law took a cab in Istanbul and he wanted to go somewhere to a certain neighborhood and he likes to get to know the area where he is. So he was following along on Google Maps and he's like, we missed the turn. And the driver's like, no, we didn't. And he's like, you missed the turn again. And he's like, no, I'm going this other way. And my brother-in-law was like, no, there's like 3 other opportunities for you to have made this left.
Oh,
And now
wow.
it's routing us in a totally different way across a bridge. And he was like, it's fine. And then the guy stopped at a light and my brother-in-law just jumped out of a moving cab, and the
Whoa.
guy spent a half an hour looking for him, and my brother-in-law hid in the dark.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is wild. I'm
Yeah.
amazed your brother-in-law had the conviction to do that. I think it's
Yeah, me
easy to
too.
think because you don't know from Istanbul, right? So like,
Right. If he wasn't looking at Google, he said if he wasn't looking at Google Maps trying to figure out kind of where the neighborhoods were and how
yeah.
everything was laid out, he would have just sat there and gotten to. And he was in the hood. Like when he finally found a car to take him back, the driver was like, "Why are you here? This is not a
Mm,
place where you should be," because he was
mm.
already in kind of like the
Shady.
seedy, dodgy,
Hmm.
whatever area of Istanbul where tourists just don't go, especially at
Mm.
9 p.m.
Wow.
So
That is
yeah,
wild. So he must have had
very lucky.
like a sixth sense. I mean, I think, there are stories from on 9/11, people who evacuated the Trade Center, like Elia, who I write about in the book, she remembers vividly being in the staircase. So you spent a lot of time. It basically took people at least a minute per floor to evacuate. So if you're
Oh
on the 20th
wow.
or 30th floor, we're talking a while. And then most people didn't leave for at least, 6 or 7 minutes after the impact for a bunch of reasons. So, but she's in the stairs. She hears that the impact, the reason that there had been this very dramatic shaking of the building was that a plane had crashed into it. So her first thought, she comes up with a story just like that, right? That's how the brain works, is we are story processing machines. And so her first story she told herself was, oh, the pilot must have had a heart attack. And she remembers feeling sorry for the pilot. And so then the second plane hits. And then she decides that it must have been two pilots and they were racing. And she's annoyed with them now, right? So you see how she's coming up with different stories, all of which are like actually more benign than the reality. Finally, as she's descending and spinning on this and talking to other people in the stairwell, she realizes they wouldn't have hit that far apart if they were racing. That doesn't actually compute. And then she had the thought, we are at war. That was the first story that entered her mind, right? And so one of the reasons your brain doesn't want you to always grapple with this reality is because it's overwhelming. And shortly after that, Elia lost her sight. She literally couldn't see. She sort
What?
of stopped moving. Yeah, this happens in extreme events where people lose their sense of sound, their sense of sight. And it's your brain is our best theory, right? Is that your brain is trying to control the inputs so that you can survive. And it becomes overwhelming. She had at that moment walked out onto the mezzanine outside of the World Trade Center and seen that this was not a small event, right? Like there were bodies on the ground, and so it was like too much for her to process. So, like a lot of people, almost everyone I interviewed who evacuated on 9/11, it was a stranger who came and took her by the elbow and said, "We're getting out of here." And to this day, she never saw her face because she'd sort of lost vision, right, momentarily. But it was because of her. So this is important because it leads to the second phase after denial, which is deliberation, which we've talked about. But this social piece of it can be very, very powerful.
Wow.
And that is, most people have a story like this on 9/11, that they did not
This
get out alone.
this is crazy. I had look, shitting yourself. I get that when you're under going blind though. That sounds like something that is not a good thing. Like you're evolved to
Right.
what evacuate your bowels because you're like your body's ready for fight or flight. Going blind is the opposite of what probably anybody needs to do when they're like, all right, we got to get out of here. Okay, I'm going to make it so you can't see anymore. Thanks, brain. Thanks a lot.
Right. And the same with, I mean, I've interviewed police officers who fired their guns and never heard it, never heard the gun go off,
Oh
and didn't
man.
have their ears ringing, even though they weren't wearing ear protection. So that is totally counter to our understanding of, hearing. But it reminds you that all the time your brain is censoring the inputs and syncing them up and deciding what you will and will not notice, right? So to speak. So, in extreme events, things can get pretty wacky pretty quickly as your brain tries to figure out how to survive.
Gosh, you mentioned the World Trade Center. I heard, speaking of gathering, right, that your carry-on a plane. I heard people were trying to take their office stuff with them and like grab. And I mean, I sort of get it. Like, oh, I want the picture of my kids, but I guess people were taking things like anything they could grab. It just felt
Yeah, I think
natural. It's like
it's
this weird quirk.
less sort of sentimental, although I'm sure that was part of it, and more a delay tactic. So what Elia described was she did not want to leave. Like every fiber in her being wanted someone to tell her to chill out and go back to work. So she remembers walking in circles in her cubicle, looking for things to take with her. Luckily, in her case, someone another coworker yelled, "Get out of the building." Otherwise, who knows if she would have made it out. But she took a novel she was reading. She was like, it's a way to kind of normalize the situation, default to what you normally do, right? You normally, when you leave an airplane, you first get your overhead bags, right? And so this is how we normally behave, and we will default to that sometimes without some clear guidance.
David Eagleman is a neuroscientist. He's been on this show, and I one of the things I discussed with him in episode, I think 929, he's been on like 5 times, but I think it's 929, why the brain slows things down
Yeah.
when you're in an emergency, and like what things it thinks are important. And it's not always the things that are actually important, which I thought was kind of funny. It's like, I remember the smell of the car seat as the crash happened. It's like, that's not exactly relevant information, but okay.
Right. And I think if I remember, this started for him, right, when he was a little kid and he was playing on a construction site and he fell, right?
Yes. Yeah.
He fell like 12 feet and he remembers that the fall took forever, right?
Yes.
And so it was really slow. And you hear this from people who've been in life or death situations, is that it feels like everything is in slow motion. So he's trying to figure out why that is and what's going on in your brain.
Just imagine how smart he would have been if he hadn't had that fall. The man's a genius. Could have cured
he would have
cancer.
researched something, much, much more pleasant, probably.
Exactly. Yeah. The other thing I've heard about happening with these folks is tunnel vision. I don't really actually know what that is. I do remember driving home 20 years ago when I first got a cell phone and getting home and going, how did I get here? And that was the moment I was like, I can never talk on this phone while driving again. That was terrifying. I was like, did I drive home? I did. God. Yeah, really. And I wasn't drunk. It was literally just the cell phone. I had to think about, I drove home. Wait, was that today? Yeah, that was today. I was on the phone with Tim. Like, it just, I was completely absent from that.
Yes, this is wild, absent. Right? Like, people tend to use, I think, lose 20% of their peripheral vision when they're on the phone, and they actually, it stays offline for them for like minutes, 5, 10, 15 minutes after they hang up. Or after they put the phone down. So it reminds me of how I was just reading about, have you read about how like the car accident rate seems to be higher in the US right now compared to Europe? And one of the theories is because when you drive with a stick shift, which is most cars in Europe, you can't hold your phone. You know what I mean?
Oh,
like, you just can't.
Totally makes sense. Yeah.
So you're kind of like a little bit more focused than you might be in the US with an automatic transmission.
I mean, I do see a lot. I'm on the highway and I see a ton of people. And whenever anyone's going like under the speed limit by 10 miles an hour, drifting in a lane, I'm like, I know that dude is freaking looking at LL Bean on his phone while driving 60 miles an hour down the highway.
Yeah,
and sure enough,
terrifying.
There he is. And I'm just like, you bet that better be really important, man. But I bet it's not.
Yeah. And I mean, that's one thing on the freeway, but we know from the research that in disasters, people's field of sight shrinks by about 70%. So it's literally like they're peering out of a keyhole. They will report, like they can describe the gun that was pointing at them in intricate detail, but not the person pointing it, right? So your brain can misfire in these situations, and some of your powers will get stronger and some will disappear.
We must have evolved that for a reason, but I can't for the life of me think about why you would want to see fewer things in a disaster.
I think the theory at least, is that you're fixated on the threat, right? Mm-hmm. So, if you were being attacked by a tiger, you would want to know where that tiger's jaw is, right? I mean, that makes sense.
Sure.
The thing is, focusing on a gun, the gun itself isn't necessarily going to help you as much, particularly identify the person later. So it's about modern threats usually versus sort of primitive, primordial threats. But all of this is because we're under the influence of stress hormones. Stress hormones are like hallucinogenic drugs at this level, and no one I've interviewed has gotten through an ordeal like this without some kind of altered reality. In one study of shootings of civilians by police officers, 94% of them, these are allegedly trained police officers, 94% experienced at least one significant distortion. But very few of them knew to expect that. So they lost their vision or sight or sound, or something was weird, like things slowed down. Sometimes things speed up for people. Sometimes things get distorted in different ways. So we don't really understand why that is, but it seems to be a kind of haphazard, ham-fisted attempt by your brain to help you.
Yeah, I was in a situation where somebody got shot near me, and I remember very few details, but the details I remember are mostly irrelevant. Like I remember hiding behind the engine block of a car. I remember my boss shooting the guy because it was a security situation. The guy was shooting at my colleagues, and then I remember washing my uniform because it was covered in pieces of someone. But I don't remember like driving home. I don't remember the precursor to the disaster. I don't remember the aftermath. I was definitely at the place all with the guys for hours. The police came. I don't remember any of that stuff. Like it was like zip, it's gone. I mean, it was like it's all in one little kind of like 1 minute snippet in my brain. But I remember like how long it took me to wash my uniform, and I pre-soaked it, and then I had to rinse it off, and then I had to throw this stuff away, and I remember all that really clearly.
Wow. I'm starting to see why you reacted pretty quickly and
Yeah, yeah,
with the other
maybe, right.
between the
That's funny. The
kidnapping
gunshot thing.
attempts and the
That's right.
gunshot at close range and
The
oh my
gunshot
gosh.
at close range was before the guy fell off the porch. You're right. That one was like a 2 out of 10 compared to the other stuff that I
Wow.
had been through by that
Man,
time in
that's a
my life.
lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
um,
No.
you have an interesting counterintuitive point about how denial can actually help us in disasters.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the situation, but sometimes there's a way in which your brain is trying to figure out what is the best response here. And for most people listening to the show, right, they're probably not in an instantaneous life or death situation, and so sometimes denial is evolutionarily appropriate, right? It's a way to make sense of the world. We have no other way to make sense of the world except pattern recognition. So, is that what you meant, or is there some other?
I don't know. My note says she has an interesting counterintuitive point about how denial can actually help us. So I was like, maybe she'll know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think we wouldn't have evolved this way if it didn't help us, right? But it depends on. It's always in retrospect that oh, I'm so glad that I didn't overreact and it just turned out to be fireworks. But then if it is actually gunshots, you're like, why am I such an idiot?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. There was when I was at LAX a few years ago. There was we thought at the time, many people thought I should say there was a shooting. But to me, I immediately said that was a suitcase or a bag hitting the ground. But even the TSA guys all ran away. They said shooter, shooter, shooter. But I didn't hear any follow-up shots. I didn't hear anybody yelling other than the people like screaming to leave. I didn't hear any aggressive yelling at it, but mostly I didn't hear anything that sounded like a gunshot, and I only heard one. So I definitely left, but I helped other people get down the jetway first. And then it turned out to be what? Oh, some idiot dropped his suitcase at the TSA thing, and one TSA guy panicked and scared everyone else out of the terminal. And that was interesting because I remember thinking to myself, what am I doing? I should get out of here just in case but then I was like, it's definitely not that. So I actually kind of maybe failed. I just happened to be right that it wasn't a shooter. But if it was, I would be like, kind of screwed. I was behind a ton of people who were clogging up the jetway
Right. Like it's
and
only
wouldn't have
in
been able to get out.
retrospect. But
Yeah,
it could also be that had you already experienced close range gunfire
yeah,
before this? Okay, so you
yes,
kind
this
of
is recent
you have like a
ish.
muscle memory for what gunfire actually sounds like,
Sure.
and it didn't trigger that, right? Like you
No.
didn't, yeah. So you kind of maybe had some reason to downplay that threat. But yeah, it's only in retrospect. I mean, these things are very easy to look at in retrospect and decide who's an idiot and who's not. But in the moment, it's very tricky. It's very tricky.
Why do people's risk profiles often fail them? I should say, why do our risk profiles often fail us? Because mine kind of failed there too. I guess it didn't because I was right, but I wasn't right because I made some expert calculation based on data. I was right because my gut instinct was to help other people and then realize this is a bunch of crap. The one thing I will say is everyone ran down the terminal towards the end and they all got bunched up, and I just ran to the left to get out towards the gate because there was no one there. That sort of herd mindset, I feel like that must kill so many people.
Yeah, and people will often go for the exit they came in on, as opposed like you have to have some situational awareness to even know that there's another exit. And you often will find people who've been in fires in the past tend to notice where exits are because they're aware of that problem. And people can be trained on this pretty quickly. You've been in theaters where they'll before the play or whatever, they'll say, just so you know, there's an exit here, there's an exit here. Like there's small things that you can do to give people a little bit of an advantage in that situation. But I mean, I guess my only thought would be when you say, my risk calculus failed me. I think the reality is we are never as rational as we want to think. That's just not how we make decisions. In fact, the technical term for how we decide what is a threat and what is not is dread, which I think is a great word because
Okay.
it so aptly fits the emotion it describes, right? So if you think about dread, it's all our evolutionary fears, hopes, lessons, prejudices, distortions in one kind of X factor. And if you break it down into its pieces from what we know about how humans experience dread, it's the function of about 6 different variables. Whether a threat feels uncontrollable to you, right? Whether it feels unfamiliar, whether you can imagine it, even if it's unfamiliar, you've seen enough movies about it, for example, whether there's a lot of suffering and the scale of the destruction, and whether it's unfair, right? So none of those are about the probability and the cost and the benefit analysis. They're all about emotional things. So if this is why we feel safer driving, technically, then we probably should, right? Because it feels controllable.
My wife drives, so I know that's the way I'm going. That's how I'm going to leave this world. My wife driving. She's a great driver, but let's just say I'm a little more risk averse than she is behind the wheel.
Oh, me too. My husband does more of the driving. I'm glad to see that we've got the genders reversed here.
Yes.
At least we're mixing it up.
She's a better driver than me, but it might also kill me one day. That's all I'm saying.
Exactly. I'm with you 100%. And because I'm more aware of the risk, which in this case, I feel like I am more rational, like just for the record. But yeah, typically when things feel like we're controlling them, we're less afraid of driving typically than we are of being in a plane crash because we're not flying it, right? And we feel out of control. Or if something feels like there's going to be more suffering, even if it's the same amount of dying, right, or risk, like cancer, right, is much scarier to people than heart attacks and that kind of thing. So, so there's like this complicated, alchemy that we are subject to when it comes to dread, and it's never as cut and dry as it seems.
I think I spent the next decade after 9/11 telling people that driving was more dangerous than flying because I had friends who were like, yeah, we're going to drive to Miami. I'm like, that's a 22-hour drive.
Yes.
Why don't you fly? It's like $79 on Spirit or whatever.
Right.
And no, my girlfriend doesn't want to fly, or I don't want to fly. It's dangerous. I'm just thinking like, it is so much safer per mile. And I had to look up all the data, and I remember trying to find this. This is sort of like pre-smartphone, right? So it was harder to find stuff like that. There wasn't an AI telling you this was safer. But it just took me forever.
It wouldn't have mattered, though. Jordan,
it didn't matter. I spent like 10 years doing it, and the number of people who listened to me, it was like a single-digit number of people changed their mind as a result of me telling them that.
I'm with you, man. I had the same reaction, and it's like, but it doesn't help. Like, we have to workshop this at another time, but how do you tell this to someone so that they will hear it? And that's the real question, because, after 9/11, as you say, the chance of dying on a major domestic commercial airplane flight, on putting aside the actual terrorist attacks, was roughly 8 in 100 million, okay, between 1992 and 2001. Driving the same distance as an average flight segment is about 65 times riskier. And we saw the same thing, by the way, people make the same mistake during the pandemic, right? Where flying remained dramatically safer than driving. But, it didn't feel safer, right? The dread factor was much higher. So as of September 2020, the probability of dying of COVID-19 after catching on an airplane was less than 1 in 4.7 million. But getting onto a crowded airplane felt more dangerous, right?
Yeah. Well, you're always bunched up next to somebody, and you're like, okay, if I can smell the guy behind me's farts, I'm gonna be able to get COVID from him too. Right? It can't be safe. Exactly. Like they said something about air ventilation, but we all know that that's not working.
We all know, right?
Yeah. Beliefs really seem to drive us here. And for Hurricane Katrina, the narrative, and I'm not saying this is a false narrative, I just mean the narrative was that a lot of people were too poor to evacuate. And I know that that's true, but maybe not the whole story. And the beliefs that people had were maybe more important than the economics. Can you tell me what you mean by that?
Absolutely. So once the research was done, often the research doesn't get done until way after the
Sure,
headlines, right? So
sure.
that's why you get this disconnect. But there was an analysis of 486 Hurricane Katrina victims that found that they were not disproportionately poor or black. That in fact, if you're looking at all the variance in evacuation behavior, income accounts for some of it. So does race, but no more than 5 or 10 percentage points. What really accounts for the differences, and this is going to sound squishy, but it's not, are people's beliefs. So it's their beliefs about how dreadful the threat is, how solid their house is. Also, like, can they trust that it will be safe if they leave it, right? Going back to trust. And also, how terrible will the evacuation experience be? If you're so basically, age turned out to be very, very important in determining who left before Hurricane Katrina, because elderly people had lived through, a bunch of hurricanes, some of which were in fact worse than Katrina, but many other things had changed, making Katrina more dangerous. And they knew that they would have to get into a crowded car with their grandkids and the dog, and it would be terrible. And so they were weighing these risks and, obviously preferencing their own personal experience, which is pretty normal.
Yeah, we kind of like to think the more life experience we have, the better we're going to be in the better we're going to be in a disaster. But it's not necessarily the case. I know there's a story of a child essentially saving lots of people during a tsunami in Thailand because the kid was like, I think I saw on TV that when that happens, you're supposed to get to high ground and not like go down and collect shells off the beach or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, kids can be incredible messengers for this kind of stuff. This is why firefighters are always showing up at schools, right? And doing like stop, drop, roll and all these trainings, because kids get to get into this if you do it the right way, and they'll remember it and they'll become evangelical about it. And so Tilly Smith is who you're talking about, who was on the beach in Thailand on vacation with her parents, and she saw the indicators, the warning signs, the natural warning signs of a looming tsunami, which most people in most places don't know. But she knew them because she learned them in her geography class. I think she was 12. She had just learned them in school. And so she saw that the ocean receded, got very shallow and weird. Fish were flopping around on the sand, and people were all going towards the water, staring at this, remarking on this. I have, photos of people gathering on the beach, staring at the water. And she said to her parents, I think there's going to be a tsunami. And so they did what most parents, would do, which is to be like, it's fine. And so, but she, to her credit, she's not as, kids aren't as worried about being embarrassed, right? Until they get a little older, I guess. But like, she wasn't worried about that. And so she really insisted. She sat down on the beach. She said, I'm not going anywhere. We need, there's going to be a tsunami. And so her dad took her back to the hotel and said, I'm a little embarrassed, but my daughter thinks there might be a tsunami coming. What do you guys think? And there happened to be another guy walking by, and he said, there was an earthquake earlier today, so it's not
Oh,
impossible. And they cleared that beach, and they saved many people's lives as a result of that little
that's
girl's warning.
That's pretty impressive. And it's also amazing that it took that much, well, I guess it's a kid saying something, right? So zero
Because
authority.
kids say so much, you know what I mean,
Yeah.
and they
Oh,
don't always
man.
get the respect that they deserve.
You mentioned in the book, and I thought this was interesting, certain disasters are more dangerous for men than for women. What is that all about? And which ones?
Yeah, do you want to guess?
Uh,
Should we play a trivia game?
I really feel like I have absolutely no idea. I mean, what could be more dangerous for men than women? The only thing I can think of is like a shipwreck, and it's like women and children first, and guys are just like, yeah, we're
Oh,
never getting
right.
off this damn thing. We're
Right,
done.
right, 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 right. So some of it will be kind of unsurprising, but some of it is surprising. So men are more likely to be killed by lightning, hurricanes, and fires. Nearly twice as many men as women die in fires, according to the U.S. Fire Administration. So why is that? Well, there's a bunch of reasons. Typically, you see more men doing more dangerous jobs that are at risk of fire, right? So, but it's also because men take more risks overall. This is, a generalization, but on average, men are more likely to walk towards smoke and drive through floods. So a lot of people, how they die in disasters is driving through standing water. This is like, if people remember nothing else from this conversation, please know this, that driving through standing water is very, very dangerous. You can't tell how deep it is. Whereas on average, not always, women tend to be more cautious. So they're earlier to evacuate. They're less likely to drive through standing water. They're less likely to stay outside when there's lightning. And this, in some ways, is a luxury, right? Like if you don't think you're going to be called weak and made fun of for going inside in the lightning storm, it's a lot easier to go inside, or if it's not your job to be outside, in a lightning storm. So it's complicated, right?
Interesting. So the answer to the questions which disasters are more dangerous for men than for women is all of them, especially if you have a big ego and you don't want to look like a wimp. Got it.
Especially put it more charitably, if you're living in a culture that doesn't give men a lot of leeway for how to be. But yes, Jordan, that is right.
I think we're hitting on the reason I didn't run away from this quote unquote gunshots at LAX. I'm like, I don't want to look like a wimp if this isn't a gunshot. I don't think that's why, because everybody ran. Yeah. But there was probably a little bit of that, unless I'm really sure this is a gunshot, I'm not going to run.
Right. You don't want to be that person.
I don't want to be that guy, along with all the other thousands of that guys who are now on the tarmac while I'm in the terminal with a potential terrorist.
Right. Yeah. But I bet in a different situation on a different day, you would react differently. So, we've seen that, right, from your story. So, it depends on your mood, right? Are you hungry? Are you annoyed? There's a bunch of things but we do know that there are some cases where it's better to be a man than a woman in a disaster. So here's a ridiculous example, but it does matter, which is on 9/11, women were almost twice as likely to get injured while evacuating. And that was because of their shoes, right? So they were wearing shoes that were uncomfortable, and you do a lot of walking to evacuate a skyscraper. And so they would take off their shoes, and then people, they would step on glass, and people would trip on their shoes and different things. So that's one thing. And another thing is, in countries where women are not typically encouraged or allowed to learn how to swim, which was a lot of countries that were hit by the tsunami, they had wildly worse death rates, women and girls. There's a lot of ways that the culture and biology can inform this, but not always the ways that we expect.
I know that I'm going to get in trouble for this, but I noted that you said obese people have way lower chances of survival, and I'm going to ask why, even though this is such a sensitive subject for people, because I think it's important. Anybody who's looking for a good reason to lose the last few pounds might listen to this. Certainly one of the reasons I wanted to get in shape was to live longer. I just wasn't thinking because of a disaster. I was more thinking like blood pressure and triglycerides.
Yeah, right. I know it does. It sounds like I'm being really harsh, but the statistics are pretty clear that on average, obese people tend to move more slowly. They're more vulnerable to secondary injuries like heart attacks, right? And they have which you can have in a disaster. Many people do, right? Many firefighters die that way. And they have a harder time physically recovering from any injuries they do sustain. So on 9/11, people who had low physical ability for many reasons, including obesity, were 3 times as likely to be hurt while evacuating the towers. Even though many people were helped. There were lots of coworkers who carried disabled coworkers out of the towers, right? At great personal risk and effort. So, yes, it is true that these things can conspire to make it much harder for you to survive for a lot of reasons, and also harder to recover, right? We talk about surviving, but we also want to recover. We want to have a full life again, and that really matters. And there's a lot of factors that can make that harder or easier.
Do they make it harder for other people to survive as well? Because it sounds like if someone has to be carried out, okay, but I don't know. If you're obese, you move more slowly. I don't know. I feel bad asking this, even though it's just data, but I think on this show, I could say something that is actually horrifically racist, and I would get thoughtful emails from people telling me why I'm wrong. But if I say, not that I've ever done that, of course, but if I say something on the show that indicates something negative about overweight people, even if it's literally science or backed up by data, my inbox is a total shite show for the rest of the month. So I'm always sort of hesitant with this. But so I'm asking you to take the flak for me by bringing it up and covering this.
Yeah, look, there's so many different dimensions that we bring to these situations. If I'm obese trying to evacuate a skyscraper, I'm going to slow that process down now, but maybe also I know where the stairs are, and I have helped my office prepare for. Unlike most offices in the Trade Center, we've done some actual training on where the staircases are. We know how they work. Like maybe I'm wearing heels, and so then I take them off, which makes me more likely to get injured. But then in other ways, like I'm incredibly compassionate and cooperative. So there's not just one way in which we show up at these things, just like every day. But it is true that we know, safety engineers have had to adjust for the size of Americans. The size, as Americans have gotten bigger, it changes the crowd dynamics. When people walk down a staircase, for example, they sway slightly from side to side, which takes up more space than our actual body width. So the heavier people are, the slower they move and the more they sway, and that means fewer people can fit down the staircase. This is just a physics problem. And the answer to that is not to shame people, but to say, look, this is the reality. This is a heightened risk. We need to maybe make staircases and escalators wider. That would be one thing, right? But we also need to help people prepare for the risks that they face, regardless of their, individual challenges.
Yeah, it's an incredibly difficult problem. I never even thought about the shoes. You got to take those things off and smack people with them if they're moving too slowly.
You know
Move
what?
it,
It's
pal.
funny. I just found under my desk because I lived in New York City on 9/11 and I was covering a lot of disasters. So I was probably a little tweaked, but I would keep, extra old pair of sneakers in my desk. And I just came across them because I moved out of that office. And I realized, you know what? There's been real progress, which is I no longer need to keep sneakers because all my shoes are so freaking comfortable now compared to like
Yeah.
in like 2001. So hopefully that will change and has changed over time.
Yeah, wow. You would think like the person who had their yoga shoes or their gym shoes in their office on 9/11 and just went like, oh, I'm going down the stairs. Let me change into these. Would have literally had a survival advantage because of that at
Yeah,
that
it's
point.
wild, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. I'd love to talk about some of these. You mentioned this earlier, like panic episodes and crowds. Tell me about the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. You always hear about people there dying in these massive crowd crushes of thousands of people. And it's almost like, look, I might be out of line here, but I know there's some chatter like, oh, well, it's okay. You go straight to paradise if you die on a pilgrimage to Mecca. And it's like, that maybe doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything about people dying there avoidably.
For sure. Yeah, we should definitely do something about people dying avoidably in all situations, including the Hajj, which I mean is a very interesting test case, because we hear about crowd crushes. Sometimes people call them stampedes, and often the crowd gets blamed. So this is a recurring theme that in our conversation about how regular people get blamed and the people in charge don't trust the public and so forth. But in this case, it's a very good example because, the Hajj has been around, this pilgrimage has been around for more than 1,400 years. Like this is not a new situation. Muslims have journeyed to Mecca, the birthplace of Muhammad, and it's required of every Muslim who can manage it. But so the deaths only started recently, starting around 1990. You started to see these crowd crushes happen, right? Now, why is that? Well, it's because of the cheaper cost of plane travel. More and more people were coming to the Hajj, and it's a physics problem ultimately, right? Like the people couldn't fit in the space. But it's even more interesting than that, which is, so in 1990, a crowd crush in a pedestrian tunnel at the Hajj killed 1,400 people in minutes.
Oh, that's unbelievable.
Just horrific. People from all over the world. And it's just, on this really, I mean, it's a very peaceful, harmonious crowd in general, right? So it's not like chaos. But here's what happened. So it turns out, and by the way, this kept happening at this exact same spot. 4 years later, another crush killed more than 270 people. And then 1998, 118 people. 2001, 35 people. It went on and on and on. And they all happened in the same area around these three pillars that all pilgrims must throw stones at as a required ritual of the Hajj. And so this beautiful holy place somehow had become a killing field for over 2,500 people. I mean, it's terrible. So it turns out that what happened, so people who study crowd dynamics, it's a lot like studying, water flow. Like
I was going to say fluid dynamics,
exactly.
But macro scale. Because I always wonder, how does this work? I'm pushing a little on someone who's pushing a little on someone else, but then suddenly it adds up to hundreds or thousands of pounds of pressure on some old lady between all of us.
Right. It's really wild. And for me, it's been really helpful to understand how that works. Because I think we imagine, at least what we see in movies and in our nightmares, right, is people just like climbing all over each other and that's not at all how it happens. Like in a way, it's more chilling, but in another way, it's less scary. I don't know how. I mean, maybe you just can't compare it. But the point is, okay, here's basically what happens typically in most crowd crushes in stadiums, in clubs, in at the Hajj. So the density gets to a point where it's very dangerous. And the density of the crowd means that one person way ahead of you can lose their footing and the crowd behind doesn't know. So they keep pushing forward unless there's really good communications, right? And that kind of thing. So you can work around this. But the crowd is just moving forward. And so they don't know that someone has fallen. And then other people try to help that person, which then creates more of a barrier, right? And they become obstacles for everybody else. And most people who die in crowd crushes, they die from suffocation. They don't die from the actual, from being
Hmm.
trampled on.
I
They
see.
die because they can't breathe, right? I mean, it's horrible. But basically, it's the compounding pressure of all of these people moving forward, not knowing, tragically, that someone up front has fallen.
Right, because
So,
you can't feel it unless it's happening to you, right? Because I'm imagining just sort of gently being pushed against someone else. But when there's hundreds of people doing that and then it goes into some narrow tunnel, those people are getting hundreds or thousands of pounds of pressure on
yeah,
their chest
exactly.
cavity.
Right. So the biggest problem here, right, is the density, but also the lack of communication. Like the people in back, we have no way of knowing someone's fallen. All we see is a small space opens up in front of us where that person used to be. So what do we
Oof.
do? Just like what we
Just
always
fill it
do,
up.
right? We fill it up, which puts more pressure on the fallen. So, you know, you're suffocating people, but you don't know, which is
Ugh,
terrible.
that is awful.
Um, because it turns out that pressure builds up exponentially, so a crowd quickly picks up the same amount of force as a 18-wheeler, I mean, as a
Oof.
Mack truck.
My
And
God.
humans can lose consciousness after being compressed for just 30 seconds, and they become brain dead after 6 minutes. They can die without ever falling down, right, just from that sheer pressure. It's like the walls are literally closing in. So it's not the kind of panic that we imagine, right? It's not like that at all. And so that's both the that's important to understand, because then that indicates how you would prevent crowd crushes, and they are all preventable, right? Like this is the thing that is really important to understand, because there have been many crowd crushes after which officials, including officials at the Hajj, have blamed the public, and when in fact it was the crowd management that was to blame.
Yeah, of course it is, right? I mean, how are you going to blame 100,000 people instead of the person whose job it is to make sure that 100,000 people have a place to go and aren't going to get bottlenecked? I mean, that's government deflection, I suppose, at its finest. I will say some of the heroism stories in the book are really inspiring. I don't think I'm cut out to jump into freezing water or run into a burning building anytime soon. Especially now, I have little kids. Maybe pre-kids, pre-wife, I would have. I'm not sure. I don't know if you've studied that at all, but I mean, before kids, I stopped to help with a car crash with a baby and a woman trapped inside, and there was a burning car another time on the highway. Pre kids, though, once I have kids, now I'm like, okay, no more figurative or literal bungee jumping of any kind at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do think, look, the research on heroism is like really, really slippery. But I did try to find as much as I could. And what I found is that there definitely is a profile. You're right that the phase of life that you're in really does seem to matter. And typically, when you see, now again, this is a vast generalization with very imperfect data. So, don't freak out, everyone listening. But people who become celebrated as heroes, which is different than people who are actually heroes, right? It's a smaller subset, tend to be more likely to be men and more likely to be childless. So that could be for lots of reasons. That could be because they don't feel the fear of leaving their children alone on this earth, or it could be, there are evolutionary theorists who would say it's because they are trying to make
Get
sure their
laid and make
reputation.
children.
Exactly. Yeah. No,
No,
you're a
really?
hero.
That's awesome. That's
Yeah.
so funny that that's a reason. Like, I don't have kids, but you know what? You know who loves a hero? The ladies.
Yeah, no,
That's
totally.
funny.
But it could be, because maybe men face more pressure, especially in certain places and times, to jump into the freezing water, or because maybe they have more experience in swimming in open water. So, it's really, really tricky. But I will say, just anecdotally, the heroes that I've interviewed, first of all, they all hate that word. Like they all really resent that word. And what's underneath that? Well, I think it's because their experience of it was very different from the way we tell the story. So all the time, people will ask heroes, why did you jump in the water? How did you, what, and their thinking is, well, how could I not?
Hmm.
Like, what does it say about you that you're even asking me this question?
Right.
And typically they explain their behavior by saying, I couldn't have lived with myself if I hadn't done this.
So it's like a values thing, maybe, from their
It's a
parents?
they're weighting different fears, like, in other words, for whatever combination of reasons, they dread having to live with themselves knowing they didn't try more than they dread the threat in that situation, right? So I think for them, they're more afraid of what would happen if they didn't take action, than like to
Yeah.
their own identity and their
Huh.
sense of themselves. And Roger Olian, who's the one that I profiled, who jumped into a freezing river after a plane crash, he said, basically, you're doing it for yourself because you wouldn't want to not do it and face the consequences internally. So in his case, he did not have children. He knew that he was a big, strong guy who was a good swimmer. He knew he wasn't going to reach those people, by the way, because of the ice and the water. But he had military training, which is also very common to a lot of just anecdotally, a lot of the people who engaged in heroics tend to have military training. Who knows if that's causal or not, but he had a kind of bias for action. He didn't want to spend the rest of his life wondering if he should have done something. And so he did everything he could do. And even though he didn't get to those passengers, they saw him coming. And that was very, very important to their survival. He survived. Most of them survived because it turned out a helicopter made it through very unexpectedly in this ice storm. But yeah.
I know something that makes for, well, at least the special forces guys, not necessarily like the hero that you just mentioned, but there's something called neuropeptide Y that I've never heard of that I'm super interested in because I want to inject it immediately. But what is this and how does it work?
Yeah, so it's a compound that it appears special forces soldiers tend to produce significantly more of than other people, and it helps you stay focused on a task under stress. So even 24 hours after a mock interrogation, say, or some kind of very intense simulation, special forces soldiers had returned to normal levels of neuropeptide Y while other soldiers remain depleted, right? So it seems like they have this kind of stockpile, maybe for some reason that we don't understand. Whereas in civilian life, people with anxiety disorders or depression, they tend to have lower levels of neuropeptide Y. So this is some research that has been done specifically for the Army on why some people, especially Green Berets, under certain situations tend to stay relatively calm and perform well. And basically, yeah, they found that they seem to remain more mentally clear, and we don't fully understand why, but it could have something to do with literally their chemical makeup.
That's interesting. Supplement dealers and sketchy pharma companies are just clamoring to bottle this, I would imagine. Maybe not
Yeah.
even sketchy, because I would imagine the military would just want to inject this into everybody and then see who makes it through
Yeah,
training.
I'm going to not recommend any of that. I don't think we know
Yeah.
how to create this. And what we do know, the best way if you want to inject yourself with some calmness for extreme events is to train for them. That's the way. Like
I
that's
like
the
that.
thing we know that helps. Yeah.
I like that. But your warning is not going to stop
I know.
biohackers or the military from trying to inject people with brain chemicals to make them into super soldiers. And we both know that. Yeah. Yeah. No.
Gotta try.
Every every 20-something guy is Googling where they can buy this online right now. But no, you're right. People
Oh, I
shouldn't.
have an even better one for the
Oh, yeah?
20-something guys.
Please.
This is the thing that also special operators train on, which is practice rhythmic breathing. I know it doesn't sound as sexy as
No.
injecting yourself with some very
It
sketchy
sure
chemical.
is cheaper. Yeah.
But literally, I interviewed a police officer who every time he was a rookie cop, every time he would call in on his radio to, responding to something serious, his voice would go up like 2 octaves and his voice would shake, which is a totally normal fear response signal when you're under too much fear. But it was embarrassing, of course. So he started doing this very clever thing, which we could all do in our own different ways, which is he would play a recording of his siren, and every day for 10 minutes he would practice doing rhythmic box breathing, which is like in for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, exhale for 4, hold for 4, and repeat. And so it got to a point where every time he heard his siren, he would just automatically do this breathing thing, right? And within a few weeks, all of a sudden, his voice was normal when he called in on the radio, which is actually a very big deal. It's not just that it was less embarrassing. It means that he's not likely to degrade. He's going to keep his eye-hand coordination. He's going to make better decisions. He's not going to lose his peripheral vision. All the things we talked about earlier are likely to be under control. So that's what I would recommend for everyone listening is practice box breathing or any kind of rhythmic breathing, especially in stressful situations so that you can do it automatically.
Oh, that's interesting. I took a kidnap evasion course, whatever. It's like an urban survival and evasion course. And they like bag your head and put you in a van, right, handcuffed. And they were like, they said, when this happens, box breathing, because you're going to have this crazy panic reaction if anything similar ever happens to you. And the way you need to stay calm because you need to like count things or listen for auditory signals about where you are or see how many right turns you made if you can do something like that, like all these little things that you're not doing when you're panicking and like, I don't know, soiling yourself or whatever else, or going blind in the back of the car.
Right. So did you practice that? Like did you take that?
I did,
advice?
but it sounds so easy, but when you are having any kind of anxiety, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4 is an eternity, and you start, you're really like, you're really just gasping for air after 1 or 2 rounds of this. It's very difficult.
It's very difficult, and it feels like this can't be right. This can't be what. I mean, I think it's the kind of thing I used to try to practice it every time I was stressed when I was in traffic. I should do that again. But anytime you don't want to practice it under duress, right? You want to practice it in a low stakes stress situation. So if there's certain things like, your kid crying or, your wife driving, whatever, like that's a good time to practice it.
It's a good idea. Yeah. My wife's going to be like, why do you always breathe weird when I drive now? Because Amanda Ripley told me to. Thank you so much, by the way, for doing the show. I like to highlight when us humans rise to the occasion, not like magically meet our expectations or whatever, but meet our higher moral virtue, perhaps. So this show has some good news as well as some actionable advice that I'll cover, especially in the show close, about building resilience and things like that. And I hope that many of us follow that. And frankly, being useful in a disaster is something we should all aspire to, in my opinion. Maybe I'm still an Eagle Scout at heart, but I really think that one of the best things you can do is at least don't be a burden to everyone around you. But ideally, you are the person who grabs the other person by the elbow and says, we're getting out of here. Right?
Yeah, right. Or maybe you're the person who leads everyone in a sing-along when you're in a tornado shelter. You know what I mean? Like there's all different opportunities, but if you do want to learn more about how to be helpful in a very tangible ways, I would encourage people to check out their local CERT organizations. There's every county typically has one. These are ways to get free training in emergency response. And so that's one thing you could do. And also, just understand what to expect so that you won't be shocked if and when it happens.
That was the course I took where I went, this is really good. I'm not going to remember 90% of this, but I still think it's a good idea. And you're right. They're taught well. They're taught by people who know what they're doing.
So it was a CERT course that you took?
It was, yeah.
Oh,
I want to say it was like a fire marshal or some fireman who taught the course or retired fireman, and he was really good, and he knew a lot about a lot. And but I remember also being like, wow, am I going to be useless in a disaster? Because this guy knows so much, and I'm going to pick up maybe 5% of this. Yeah, it's a bit much. But you know what? It's better to take even if you just remember anything, because I really think that most of us, like we talked about at the top of the show, are quite useless when it comes to a disaster. And at best, we're useless, and at worst, we're actually making things worse for everybody around us, which is
right. Well, I mean, in our
good.
modern world, we've become very interdependent. Like we don't
Yeah.
know how to do things that we for most of our history knew how to do. So yeah, I think it's helpful just to have like some sense of your own agency. So for people who might be interested, the CERT stands for Community Emergency Response Team. So that's what you want to Google. And again, they're locally run. Some are much better than others, but it's worth checking out if you're interested.
Amanda Ripley, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Jordan. It was fun. Appreciate it.